Good morning, this is Kim Hammer with your devotion taken from the book of 1 Samuel chapter 11. We find this is going to be Saul's first real test as king. There was a city that was made up in the nation of Israel that was under attack by the Ammonites, who had come in and said they were going to take over the people, and for every person in that city they were going to gorge their eye out in order to make them an embarrassment to the rest of the nation of Israel, and also kind of like a trophy to the Ammonites, that they would be able to say, this is what we've done to the Israelites by embarrassing them with their eyes being gorged out. When word got back to where Saul was and to the people that were there with Saul, we find, of course, there was a great upheaval and that they were very upset. Now, Saul was out in the field working his oxen, which I think there's an understatement to that, and that is that Saul had been appointed king, and most times when somebody takes a position of power like that, they're kind of elevated to a status that gets above the common person. But in reality, we find that Saul stayed connected to God, because what was it that he was doing when the people came back and told them of the plight of the city that was going to be taken over by the Ammonites? He was out working his oxen in the field. He was doing just what the common folks were doing. He was working for a living. He was getting his hands dirty. His hands were being calloused. I think there's something to be said for a leader that stays connected to the people that they represent, and that they themselves are still working, understanding what the working people are going through. And Saul was that kind of king at this time. Later, it didn't work out that way, but we'll address that later as we go through it. But for right now, Saul was connected with people. So when the people came and said, hey, our fellow citizens are under attack, Saul felt like they were attacking him because he was one of them. So he rallied all the Israelites together. He did send out a threat and said, if you don't come, I'm going to come kill every oxen you got. And evidently he had some influence because the people responded. But where did that influence come from? Look at what happened in verse 6, that when Saul heard about it, it tells us that the Spirit of God came upon him in power, and he burned with anger. There's a reason why the scripture is written exactly the way it is. The first thing that had to happen was he had to get under the power of God, and the second thing that had to happen was he had to get mad. Now, if he got mad and then he tried to get the power of God, it wouldn't have worked out the way it did. But because the power of God came upon him and then he got angry, what he did with his anger was going to be righteous and not unrighteous. And there's a lesson in that. We need to stay under the power of God so that whatever we do, including our anger, it's used in a way that glorifies God and doesn't just bring a vindication upon those that we think have done wrong. We find that whenever it is that we as God's children have the tendency to want to get mad because we don't like what's going on in the world, we need to make sure that we're under the power of God first so that our anger responds appropriately. There's nothing wrong with a child of God getting mad. There's nothing wrong with a child of God seeing an act of unrighteousness and using anger that's under the power of God's control to try to make that right. There's nothing wrong with that when you see something wrong prevailing, that you use that anger that God has given you in a righteous way in order to try to make it right. And also, there's nothing wrong with using anger in order to protect those that God has given us and entrusted us the responsibility of protecting, like God had done with Saul in the nation of Israel. So that when Saul went out and defeated the Ammonites to where there was not two of them standing side by side, it wasn't Saul that got the glory, it was God that got the glory. And we know that is true because when they came back and they were celebrating what God had done, there were some who said, now where are those people that said they didn't want Saul to be our king? They were going back to what happened at the end of chapter 10. They wanted to bring him out and to hang him. But Saul and Samuel took control because they were operating under the power of God, and they didn't let the anger of the people who were at that moment not operating under the power of God. They were operating under the spirit of vengeance, and they said, no, this is a day that's set aside to glorify the Lord for what he did. Now, there is one important note I want to make as well, that when you get to chapter 11 and verse 7, when Saul decided that he was going to go out and defeat the Ammonites, he didn't go out by himself. The Bible specifically says that Saul and Samuel went out together. One of the marks of a true spiritual leader, one of the marks of a smart leader over any group of people, is that they don't go it on their own, but they bring the presence of God with them. Saul didn't go out into battle by himself. He took the spiritual leader Samuel with him because he wanted to do all things right according to God. And there should be a lesson in that for us today. Anybody who's appointed to a leader of authority or position of authority and leadership role, if they don't have the presence of God and they don't have a symbol of God with them, then they're doing it for themselves and they're not doing it for the glory of God. Here's the takeaway. When the power of the Lord comes upon a person, great things are going to happen, and there's a pattern that's going to be followed. First of all, a threat will arise. Secondly, a leader will step forth. Third, a challenge must be issued to everybody around that leader. Are you going to be with me or against me? And then we find that a separation of those who are willing to follow must take place, so that those who are not willing to follow are separated away before the battle is fought. And there's a battle that must be fought. And when there is a time that the battle is completed, old wounds must be healed, and God, at the end of it, must be given the power and must be given the glory and the victory. That's the pattern that happened in chapter 11. Let's get under the power of God so that this pattern can play out in our life when God presents us our opportunities.